Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this evening. So appreciate your taking the time, and I hope that the information that I'm going to present tonight is helpful for you. So I'm Drew Heilpern from Summit Educational Group, and before I dive in, I just want to cover a couple of quick logistical things. The first one is we are recording this. I'm going to cover a lot of ground tonight in a relatively short amount of time. So please don't feel like you have to hang on my every word. I'll obviously feel flattered if you do, but you'll get to the link to the recording. You should get it tomorrow or on Friday. So that way, if you want to go back and rewatch and re-listen to any of this, you'll have access to the recording. And then also, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to type them in the Q&A box. Again, I'll keep an eye on the time, keep us moving tonight. I will hold questions to the end. Just again, there's a lot of info that I'm going to try to cover. But if you have questions, please don't hesitate to type them in that Q&A box, and I'll circle back at the end and answer any questions that you have. But three major goals for the presentation tonight. The first one is really just to try to put these tests in context for you. They are not the be all end all of the college admission process. Your students' lives do not depend on their SAT or ACT scores. Having said that, I don't want us to completely put our heads in the sand either around these tests, because depending on the schools that ultimately end up on your students' lists, there are some schools out there that will see the scores, consider the scores, put some weight on those scores, but anything we can do to keep these tests in perspective and not give them more life than they deserve is always helpful. And then second goal tonight, as the title suggests, we're just going to do a little bit of a deeper dive on the ACT and this new digital adaptive SAT, just so you have a better understanding of the format and content of these tests, and also some of the differences between them. And then third goal tonight, just at the end, I'll end the presentation talking about a testing plan. Just at a high level, I'll talk about some general guidelines, some things to think about as you're thinking about your students' standardized testing plan. So with that as a quick intro, let's just dive in here. Okay, so I start here. I start with this slide because this is back to that idea that at the end of the day, these really are just tests, not the be all end all of the college admission process. And from the slide, as you can see, there's a number of different factors that are going to go into that final admission decision. But the most important thing, the number one thing that college admission officers are going to look at is a student's grades, their transcript, their day in and day out performance in school. The next thing that they're going to look at is what's called strength of curriculum. You'll also hear it referred to as rigor of the curriculum. Did students challenge themselves academically? Did they take advantage of the academic opportunities presented to them at their high school? And then for those schools that lean into testing or consider testing scores, the two major tests that the colleges are looking at are either the SAT or the ACT. I will say that colleges here in the US accept both tests equally. They do not have a preference for one test over the other. They do not see one test as a superior test and the other test as an inferior test. They accept both equally. And then for students who are in AP courses and taking AP exams and choose to share those AP scores with colleges, schools will see those scores if you send them and consider those scores in that admission process as well. But even those colleges that are getting, for instance, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 plus applications now, they are reading the student essays that are part of those applications. They are reading the counselor and teacher recommendations. They are looking at your students' extracurricular activities, any position of leadership they've had, any work experience they may have had. And then all of these factors are going to go into that final admission decision. And for those of you going through this process for the first time, the term you'll hear around this college admission process is what's called a holistic review. And what the college admission folk are doing with this holistic review is they're really trying to get to know the applicant as a person, not just as a number. So they're not just going to take a student's grades or GPA and put it in some kind of formula with their SAT or ACT scores and then make that admission decision based on that number. all of these factors are going to go into that final admission decision. And I do just want to spend a couple minutes just talking about the test optional schools and test optional school landscape. So almost all colleges and universities have continued these test optional policies. So many colleges, or almost all colleges in the US, went test optional during the height of the pandemic. And then fingers crossed, kind of as we come out of the pandemic, many institutions have decided to consider or continue these test optional policies. So when your student applies to a test optional school in the fall of their senior year, what that means is they're in control of their scores. So they decide whether to submit those scores as part of that application or not. So just in the fall of senior year, they're looking at their SAT or ACT scores. They feel good about those scores. They feel like those scores are reflective of the work they've been doing day in and day out in school. They feel like those scores will be supportive of their application. Even though they are applying to a test optional school, by all means, they'll include those scores as part of that application. Those college admission officers will see the scores, consider the scores in that overall application read. But just if for whatever reason, right, those scores came back a little bit lower than what that student was hoping for or expecting, just really not in line with what they've been doing day in and day out in school, just really not reflective of their academic abilities. They are not obligated to send that score to that test optional school. That college admission officer is not going to see that score. That college admission officer is not going to try to guess in terms of what that score may have been. They don't have time for that. If you apply to a test optional school without standardized testing scores, what that school is probably going to do, a little bit of a deeper dive on that transcript. So a deeper dive on the grades, a deeper dive on that rigor, just to convince themselves that that student can handle the rigors of that particular college or university. And again, almost many colleges and universities have extended or continued their test optional policies. But there are some exceptions. So some schools have gone back to requiring standardized testing. So Brown, they announced earlier this week that they were going back to requiring. Yale, they've taken what they call a test flexible approach, which means you can submit an SAT or an ACT, but you can also potentially submit an AP score in lieu of those. But there is some standardized testing that you need to submit for your application to be complete at Yale. Dartmouth's gone back, MIT's gone back, Georgetown's gone back. Some of the larger state universities, particularly in the South, like University of Florida, University of Georgia, University of Tennessee, for example. If a military academy happens to end up on your list, like a West Point or the Naval Academy, all of these institutions have gone back to requiring standardized testing. But just knowing there are still many schools out there that are continuing these test optional policies, we can say with a high degree of confidence that there's going to be a number of schools on your students list that are test optional. And with that in mind, I really encourage students to see these tests almost as a chance to show off a little bit. It's another objective data point that they can potentially share with colleges just to show their academic readiness, that they're ready for the rigors of that particular college or university. But knowing they're going to be applying to some test optional schools and they're going to be in control of those scores, whether to send those scores or not, I really want students to see these tests almost through an everything to gain, nothing to lose mindset. There are a couple caveats to the test optional landscape just to be aware of. So the first one is if you are applying to some of those more or most selective test optional schools, just be aware that we are seeing the percent of students applying to these institutions with standardized testing scores is starting to tick back up. So for instance, at Duke University, even though they are continuing to be test optional, if you look at the data that they've published, it was close to 90% of their incoming class this past year actually had standardized testing scores. So again, for an institution like Duke, yes, there are students getting into Duke without standardized testing scores, but the vast majority of students who are enrolling had and submitted testing scores as part of their application. Also, if you're a recruited athlete, Even though the NCAA clearinghouse has permanently adopted test optional policies, so you do not need standardized tests in order to play at the Division I or Division II level. Depending on the college and depending on the sport, we are still hearing from some coaches that they still want to see standardized testing scores from their recruited athletes. And the reason for that is just those colleges and universities want to ensure that their college coaches are recruiting student athletes that meet a certain academic standard and a certain academic threshold. And standardized testing might be part of the formula that they're using to determine whether or not a student is potentially recruitable or not. And then the third caveat under this kind of test optional umbrella here is just around this idea of a merit scholarship award. So what a merit scholarship award is, it's generally a non-need-based financial aid award. For those colleges that give merit scholarships, they're using it as a recruitment tool. So they're trying to entice strong students to apply and ultimately enroll at their institution. And the reason why I talk about merit scholarships here under this test optional banner is just be aware that there are schools out there that admit test optionally, but when they consider these merit scholarship awards, they might still be factoring in standardized testing scores. And the college admission folk, they try to be as transparent in their policies as they can be. So if you are applying to a test optional school that you know gives merit scholarship awards, you can always just ask them, do they consider standardized testing scores in those awards or not? And they'll give you an honest answer in terms of what their policies are. And then the last point that I want to make around the test optional landscape is just around this idea of strategic submission. So what strategic submission means is, let's say, for instance, in the fall of their senior year, your student applies to 8 test optional schools. With strategic submission, your student doesn't have to decide like, okay, Drew, I'm going to send my scores to all 8 of those schools or to none of those schools. With strategic submission, students can actually decide to submit those scores on a school by school basis. And you can see kind of pre-pandemic, only about 4% of students nationally kind of knew about this and were taking advantage of this. Then with COVID and the pandemic and almost all schools going test optional, you can see that percent went up 6-fold. The next time this survey is done, it's going to be like well over like 50, 60+% of students, just as word gets out and more students know that they can take advantage of this. So back to our hypothetical student, applying to those 8 test optional schools, they might end up deciding that they're going to send their scores to 6 of their test optional schools, and then maybe for whatever reason they're going to hold their scores back from those 2 test optional schools. But this idea of strategic submission, it kind of dovetails nicely with that philosophy that I want students to have as they think about these standardized tests. With that everything to gain, nothing to lose mindset, not only are students going to be in control of their scores, but with strategic submission, they're going to be in control of those scores on a school by school basis. And again, I'm going to hit you with a lot of information tonight in a relatively short amount of time. But if you only remember one slide from this entire presentation, this is the slide that I want you to remember. At the end of the day, helping students hit their full potential on these tests comes down to having a testing plan. And that testing plan, it's answering 3 pretty straightforward questions. Which test should I take? When should I take them? And how and when should I prepare for them? And if your student has this testing plan mapped out ahead of time, it's just going to reduce some of the anxiety that always seems to surround standardized testing. Just students knowing when they need to be thinking about these tests and when they need to have them on their radar can go a long way in terms of reducing some of that stress. And I'll come back to these points, but I do want to make them now. The first point that I want to make is I know there's huge pressure on our students for just early and often testing. Just keep testing, 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 and start that process earlier, and earlier. But keep in mind, performance on these tests, it does correlate with age, maturity, and time spent in school. Everything that students are doing and are learning in school on a daily basis is helping them prepare for these tests. So what that means statistically is most students are going to peak on these tests later in spring of junior year into that fall of senior year. And when students are most ready to take these tests, that's when I want them to take them. And then the other point that I want to make around the testing plan is at the end of the day, that quote perfect testing plan, is what works best for you as a family and what works best for your student. So please do not worry if your testing plan ends up looking a little bit different than what a best friend is doing or what a neighbor is doing or possibly even what an older sibling ended up doing. There's many paths to success here. It's really what's going to work best for you. And that testing plan is going to be customized for your student. Okay, as we do a deeper dive on the standardized testing landscape, let's start by just talking about this new digital adaptive SAT. So the College Board announced the transition to this online adaptive test at the end of January in 2022. And when the College Board made this announcement, we were not surprised by this. This is something that the College Board has been talking about for years and years and years and years. I think finally, technology-wise, kind of the world kind of caught up with their vision for being able to unveil this new test. But we've been preparing for this new digital adaptive SAT for a number of years, even prior to them making this announcement, because again, it's something they've been talking about and wanting to do. So they released the digital PSAT this fall. So if you had students taking the new online digital adaptive PSAT in October, it has the exact same structure and format for the new digital adaptive SAT, which is coming this March. So the first administration of it for our students here in the US is actually in a couple days. It's going to be this March 9th. And for our class of 2025, so for our juniors, sometimes they hear this and they're like, oh my gosh, Drew, so we're going to be like the guinea pigs for this new test. But let me just reassure you, even though it's being released here in the US for the SAT officially in March, in a few days, the College Board actually released this test internationally back in the spring of 2023. So in March of 2023, May, June, and then in the fall, last fall, so August, October, November, and December, there's already been 7 official administrations of this new test internationally. So students have taken it. International students have actually applied to college with it and gotten into college with those scores. And from the international students that we've worked with, everything seems to have gone well. So taking the test itself went smoothly for them. They scored how they thought they were going to score. There weren't any surprises in terms of taking that test. So our fingers are crossed, but we are optimistic that the administration this Saturday is going to go smoothly for our students here in the US, that it's going to go well. So let me just talk about this the new platform that students are going to be taking this test on. So for students who are on the call who took a PSAT, you've already experienced this because the PSAT and the SAT, students take it through what the College Board has called the Blue Book app. So before students are able to take the test, they need to download the Blue Book app. Again, if your student has taken or took the digital PSAT this past fall, they've already done this. They've already had some practice and some exposure to what taking this test on this platform looks like. So here's if you're interested in checking it out, here's the link for the Blue Book app. there are some free practice tests that are available through the app. I will say for students to access these practice tests, they do need their College Board account. So the College Board has released 4 full-length practice tests, SAT tests. I think there's at least one, there might be 2 digital adaptive PSAT practice tests. Here at Summit, we've developed 3 full-length practice tests that are also adaptive, that closely mimic the look and feel of the official tests. So definitely reach out to us for those. We're working on a 4th one. We're hoping to have our 4th midsummer at the latest, so we'll keep you posted on that. But I just wanted to point out that there are practice tests available for students through that Blue Book app. I do tell students, you got to space them out a little bit. The College Board is trying to add more. They haven't really released their timeline for when they're going to do that. So obviously, not that students would, but I don't want students, over the next couple of weeks logging into their Blue Book account, right, and taking all 4 of these official tests, right? They need to space them out. And then similarly with us, definitely reach out to us to take advantage of the practice tests that we have created. But even though it's an online test now, the College Board, the SAT, they are trying to mimic still the look and feel of a paper and pencil test. So what I mean by that is they've built in some features into this Blue Book app, into this online testing platform that are similar to the types of features or the type of tools that students would have with just a regular test booklet and paper and pencil test. So this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like on the verbal side. And what I mean by that is I didn't animate these, but if students click, once they're in the Blue Book app, if they click on this annotation field tool, what that's going to bring up is it's going to bring up a highlighter so they can highlight text in the passages. It's also going to bring up an annotation box so students can, take notes or annotate a passage just as they could with a test booklet. The SAT, it's still a multiple choice test. So being a multiple choice test, we know process of elimination is huge on this. Most of the questions are multiple choice. On the math, there are some free response questions where students aren't given possible answers. They have to generate their own answer. But to mimic the use of process of elimination on this online test, what they've created is this answer eliminator feature. So if students click on this box, what that's going to allow them to do is just cross out answers that they think are incorrect to help them, quote, find that correct answer. They can uncross answers just if they change their minds. They can, remove their cross to essentially bring it back, their cross out. So that's also a nice feature that they built into the app. Students can also mark a question for review. So by clicking here, so let's say a student got it down to 50-50, or let's say they skipped the question and want to mark it for review. And then what they're able to do is if they click on this box here in the lower middle of the screen where it says question 1 of 27, what that's going to bring up is a dashboard. And on that dashboard, it's going to bring up every single question students have answered within a module. So every question they've answered, any question that they've skipped, and any question that they've marked for review that they want to go back if they have time and rework that question. So just as with the paper and pencil test or a test booklet where students could circle a question in the book that in their booklet that they knew they wanted to go back to and double check, using this mark for review and also the dashboard here, they can skip around the test within that module. They can go back and any question that they've skipped, they can easily identify which question they skipped, and anyone they've marked for review, they can easily go back by just clicking on that number on that question on that dashboard to be able to go back and review their work or change an answer. The other feature that the platform has is a timer. So there is going to be a proctor in the room when students are taking the test, but the proctor themselves is not responsible for the timing of each section of the test. It's going to be done through the timing feature that's built into the platform. And for nervous students who are just like, Drew, oh my gosh, like that's like the last thing I want to see is this timer like counting down on me. You can hide it, you can unhide it and bring back the timer at any time so students know how much time they have on that section. So this is what it looks like on the verbal side of the test. This is what it looks like on the math. So on the math side, very, very similar features that we've already seen. Like they have the answer eliminator, they have the mark for review, you have the dashboard here, you have the timer. But the other feature that the platform has is this built-in Desmos graphing calculator. So students can bring up this calculator at any time on any math question that they're going to see on the SAT. And this is true of the digital PSAT as well. And if you're not familiar with the Desmos calculator, it is a very, very powerful graphing calculator tool. It can be very helpful in answering some of the math questions that students are going to encounter on this test. So students can absolutely bring in their own graphing calculator, so they can use their own TI-83 or TI-84, but we do recommend that students practice with the Desmos calculator, know how to use it, get familiar with it and comfortable with it, because again, it is a powerful tool and very, very helpful in answering some of the math questions that they're going to encounter on this test. I will also mention that for the math section, students get scratch paper, so they can work out problems, still paper and pencil on that scratch paper. Obviously, when they put in their answer, they have to enter their answer online to record their answer, but they don't have to solely, do math in their head or use the calculator in order to solve problems. They'll have that scratch paper to be able to work through problems as well. So that's what the platform looks like. Again, just wanted to show it to you for the parents and guardians on the call, just so you get familiar with what taking this test online actually looks like and actually feels like for students. Okay, so as we do a deeper dive on the various tests that students are going to encounter as part of their standardized, as part of the college admission testing landscape, I'll start with the digital PSAT. And the digital PSAT, it really is just practice for that digital SAT. Again, that's starting this March. So colleges don't see PSAT scores. They don't make any admission decisions based on PSAT scores. It really is just for practice, because anytime students can take a test under official conditions, especially when it doesn't really count for anything, it's always good practice. It's always good practice for them. And I do just want to talk real quickly about the scoring of the PSAT compared to the SAT. So you can see the PSAT is on a 160 to 760 scale, where the SAT is on a 200 to 800 point scale. So when students realize this, that the PSAT is out of 760 instead of out of 800, usually what they'll ask me is like, Drew, it's out of 760 instead of 800. So when I get my PSAT math score back and my PSAT verbal score back, can I just add 40 points to those scores? And that would be my SAT score. And you can probably tell by the tone of my voice and the way that I'm talking about this, but the answer to that is unfortunately, no, they cannot. So you can kind of get a sense for this, the way the slide is organized, but these tests are all what they're called vertically aligned in their scoring. So what that means is you can use a PSAT score as a baseline score for the SAT, because it is the score your student would have gotten had they taken an SAT on that day. So for instance, if they got 550 math, 550 verbal, that 1100 would be their SAT score. But the reason why it goes to 760 instead of 800, in some ways, this is the College Board acknowledging that students are taking this test a little bit early. So for our juniors, they're taking that in October of junior year. We know they're not going to peak on this test until late spring of junior year into that fall of senior year. So to account for that, some of the hardest math questions, for instance, in that 760 to 800 point range that are on the SAT, just aren't on that PSAT. So that's why the PSAT is cut off at 760. Similarly, on this end of the scale here, in that 160 to 200 point range, there's some easier questions on the PSAT that just aren't on that SAT. But I always try to remind juniors, please don't panic if that PSAT score came back a little bit lower than what you were hoping or what you were expecting. Where you start on a PSAT and where you end up on an SAT or even an ACT for that matter is often two very different places. But it does give you a baseline score. It does give you a general sense in terms of where you're starting on this or in this process. Okay, again, the two major tests that the colleges are looking for are either the ACT or the SAT. And here's a quick side-by-side comparison of the two tests, just so you can get a feel for them. Again, colleges accept both tests equally. They do not have a preference for one test over the other. They do not see one test as a superior test, the other test as an inferior test. They are accepted equally. And just looking at this slide, you can get a sense there is some overlap in terms of the content between these two tests, but very, very different in terms of the philosophies behind them. So the SAT is more of what we call a power test. Just there's some harder reading on that SAT compared to the ACT. There's some trickier questions. There's more misdirection on that SAT, just trying to make things seem a little bit harder than it actually is. Whereas the ACT, the reading's a little bit easier. The questions are a little bit more straightforward, but the difficulty of the ACT comes from the pace of it. It's an incredibly fast-paced test. It's almost a total sprint from start to finish on that ACT. So most students who take an ACT for the first time, or ideally a practice ACT for the first time, usually they'll walk out of that testing experience and be like, Drew, I actually didn't think the ACT was that bad. I just wish I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section. If I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section, I really feel like I could have crushed it. But that's where the difficulty of the ACT comes from. Most students feel rushed on it. Most students feel like they don't have the time they truly need to hit their full potential on that test. The other thing you'll notice is because the digital SAT has gone to an adaptive structure, it is actually a shorter test now. So it's 2 hours and 14 minutes on that digital SAT. And I'll walk you through how the adaptive scoring is going to work. And I'll also highlight how, because of the adaptive nature, they're able to shorten the test, but still have a valid test and still keep it on that same kind of 200 to 800 point scale that we all kind of know and love. On the ACT, it's a longer test. It's about 3 hours. It still has this optional essay or optional writing at the end of that test. Colleges really aren't looking for that optional writing score. They're not putting any weight on it. So our general advice to students is if they end up going down an ACT path, to register for the ACT without that optional writing. You're not going to need it. Colleges aren't looking for that test. So on the digital SAT, 200 to 800 on what I'm going to call verbal, 200 to 800 on math. So it's still on that 400 to 1600 point scale. The ACT, if you're not familiar with the structure of the ACT, is divided up into 4 different sections. That English is the grammar portion of the test. The math, again, the difficulty is the pace of it. It's 60 minutes, 60 questions. It's about 1 minute per question. Again, almost a total sprint on that section. The reading section, students are given longer passages, and then there's questions they need to answer pertaining to those passages. Again, the difficulty is the pace of it. It's 35 minutes. It's 40 questions. Students really have to move quickly to get through that. This science section on the ACT, don't get thrown by the term science here. It's not like what's the chemical formula of photosynthesis. It's more deductive reasoning and logic. It's more of a scavenger hunt than anything. Can students find the information they need in those scientific passages to answer the questions? Again, the difficulty is the pace of it. It's 35 minutes. It's 40 science-related questions that students need to work through in that 35 minutes. If you're not familiar with the scoring on the ACT, it takes a little bit of getting used to. It's on a 1 through 36 scale. What colleges mostly care about is the composite score, and that composite score is just the average. So the average of the English, math, reading, and science sections. Again, colleges accept both tests equally. So really at the end of the day, it's up to your student to decide kind of whether they want to go down an SAT path or whether they want to go down that ACT path. So again, just to highlight the difference in terms of the timing on these two tests, with the SAT being more of a power test, more time per questions. On the verbal, it's about 71 seconds per question. per, yeah, 71 seconds per question. Whereas the ACT English, again, that's the grammar portion of the ACT. You can see how fast it is. It's 45 minutes. It's 75 questions that students need to work through, about 36 seconds per question. Again, on that reading, under a minute per question that students have. Same story on the math. SAT math students have about time and a half more time per question on that SAT compared to that ACT. All right, so we already mentioned this a number of times that SAT is going to this adaptive structure. So when I talk about an adaptive test, what I mean by that is at the 30,000 foot view, how students perform on an earlier part of the test predicts their overall score range. And then questions that they see later in the test are used to refine that score and hone in terms of what that student's skill level is and what their final score is actually gonna be. So just to orient us, so you get a better understanding of what this looks like. So on the digital SAT, the verbal section, it's divided up into what we're going to call modules. So there's module 1 on the verbal, then module 2 on the verbal, and then same structure on the math. There's module 1 on the math, and then module 2 on the math. And this is true for both the reading and the math. But what students are going to get in that module 1, think of this as like a heat map. This is like a heat map of difficulty of level of questions. So in that first module, for both the verbal and the math, students are going to get some easier questions, some middle level questions, some hard questions, some of the hardest questions that actually appear on this test. And then depending on how well students do on that first module, the test is then going to adapt to their performance in this first module. And depending on how they did, it's going to send them to one of two second modules, either a harder module or an easier second module. So if students did well on that first module, and we think by doing well, what that means is answering about 2/3 of the questions correctly in that first module, the test then adapts. They know how they did on that first module, and then that student's going to be sent to that harder second module. So based on how that student did in the first module, the test already knows that this student is somewhere in the 450 to 800 point range. It doesn't know where that student is in that range. So what students are going to get, as the name implies, they're going to get some hard questions, some harder questions, some of the hardest questions on this test to try to figure out, is this a 450, a 550, a 650, a 750, or even an 800 level math student, for instance. Let's say a student struggled with that first module. Let's say they answered about 50% of the questions correctly. Again, after they complete that module, the test knows how they did on that first module. And the test will then send them to what we're calling this easier second module. So in this easier second module, again, as the name implies, students are going to get some easier questions, some middle level questions. There is going to be the occasional hard question, but just note, if students end up in this easier second module, and they answer every one of these questions correctly, their score is still going to be capped. And we think their score is going to be capped somewhere in kind of the 620, 630 range. But this is how the adaptive SAT is able to shorten the test, but still keep it valid. So back to, let's say, our hypothetical, stronger math student who ends up in this harder second math module. The test already knows that this is not a 200 level, 300 level, low 400 level math student based on how they did on that first module. So the test doesn't need to waste that student's time asking them questions in that range of difficulty. They already know that student's going to answer them correctly. So this is how the SAT is able to shorten the test, so 2 hours and 14 minutes, but still keep it a valid test and still keep it on that same 200 to 800 point scale. So our general advice to students is we know that it's an adaptive test, but for students not to worry about that. So when students get their scores back, the score report does not tell them whether they ended up in the higher module or the harder second module or the easier one. It's not part of the score report. Colleges don't see whether they were in the harder module or the easier module. So if, for instance, a student's got, let's say they got a 550 verbal, they could have gotten that 550 by going to the harder module or the easier module. It does not matter. That 550 is still a 550 regardless of if they got it from the harder module or the easier module. So we encourage students, just do the best you can, live in the moment. At the end of the day, the way you're going to hit your full potential on this test is just answer as many questions as you can correctly and not give any kind of mental energy when you get to that second module trying to figure out, like, am I in the harder module or am I in the easier module? Just stay in the moment. Don't try to kind of guess which module you are in, because again, the test is not going to tell students. It doesn't tell them during the test, and even when they get their scores back, it doesn't tell them which module they got. Obviously, if a student scored 650 or higher, we pretty much know that they ended up in that harder module, but where that scores overlap in that 200 to 4, in that 200 to kind of, or I mean, in that 450 to kind of 600 point range there, or low 600s, again, it could be either module there. But that's the way the adaptive scoring works. Again, it's what they call section adaptive, where the test only adapts once. It doesn't adapt in real time. It adapts after students have completed that first module. So the other change that the digital SAT has made is they've redefined what they call a passage. So a passage is no longer these long kind of essays that students need to read. A passage is now much, much shorter. So it looks like this. It's like 3 or 4 sentences long. But just because the passage got shorter, it doesn't mean that this verbal section got easier. It's still going to require, because it's still a power test, it's still going to require a close reading and analytical reading, almost a line by line, word by word reading of this passage. So we're not going to go through these. Don't worry, I'm not going to unmute anyone and call on you to actually answer any of these questions. It's really just to give you a better feel in terms of how kind of the power of the SAT compares to that speed of the ACT. So this is what a grammar question looks like. Again, the digital SAT, it's a reading and writing section. So they've combined reading questions with these grammar questions. So this is what the ACT English section, or the grammar portion of the ACT looks like. Students are given long passages, and then students are asked to correct the grammatical errors as they work their way through that passage. Just the reading on the ACT, again, just a little bit easier. Doesn't require that deeper, closer, more analytical reading. It's more of like a peer editing assignment. These ACT English passages, they're more written in kind of the voice of like a typical high school student. And then again, the assignment is as students are working their way through this passage, they have to correct the grammatical errors as they work through it. But again, the difficulty is the pace of it. It's 45 it's 5 passages, 15 questions each. So 75 questions in total. And again, students only have 45 minutes to get through this. So on the digital SAT reading, again, we just saw this, but again, it's not these long essays that students need to read. It's these short passages, but again, doesn't mean that it's easier. So here we get an excerpt from a 19th century British novel. There's some difficult sentence structure here that students have to fight their way through in order to be able to answer this question. So on the ACT reading, it is the long passages. So there's 4 passages, 10 questions per passage. And this is actually abridged. It's about 600 to 700 words that students need to read for each passage. But because it's such a speed test, because students have about 4 minutes to read this and understand it, and they can't just skim it, and about 4.5 minutes to answer 10 questions on it. The questions are more along these lines. The passage points to this. Just in that limited amount of time, can students show that they've read and understood the passage, understood that central argument that that author was trying to make? Which then brings us to everyone's favorite topic here, the math on these tests. And I choose these two examples because, again, I think it does a nice job of highlighting that difference between that power on that digital SAT with that speed of that ACT. So these are both about slope of the line. And I'll just read the digital SAT one just so you can hear it. But the digital SAT math question goes something like this. The graph of the linear function f has intercepts at a0 and 0b in the xy plane. If a plus b equals 0 and a doesn't equal b, which of the following is true about the slope of the graph of f? And most students kind of have the same reaction that we all have, especially when I read it like that, which is usually like, Drew, like, what on earth? Like, I have no idea. I have no idea what this is even asking me, let alone trying to figure out how to actually answer this question. So it's not actually as bad as it seems. They could have asked this in a much more straightforward way. They could have simply said, the graph of the linear function f has intercepts at -2, 0, 0, 2 in the xy plane. What is the slope of that line? And had they worded it that way, most students would see that question and be like, oh, it's asking me to find the slope of the line between 2 points. I totally know how to do that. But for students to figure out that this is all that question is asking, they need to figure out this whole a plus b equals 0 and a doesn't equal b and how it relates back to that earlier part of the question. Whereas the ACT just way less interested in playing that misdirection game, much more straightforward of a question. Students are given 2 lines. One of the lines has the slope of 3. Then students are asked to find the slope of that perpendicular line. Now, you either remember that perpendicular lines have negative reciprocal slopes or you don't. If you do remember it, you know the answer choice is C, -1/3. If you don't remember that, you're kind of just choosing your favorite ACT letter here and then moving on to that next question. There's no getting inside the test taker's head. There's no trying to figure out what that question is actually asking you. You either know it or you don't. Again, that difference between that speed of the ACT compared to that power on that SAT, which then brings us to that ACT science section. It is designed to kind of overwhelm students. Most students who encounter an ACT science section for the first time, usually their reaction is something like, Drew, there's just no way. There's no way in 35 minutes I'm going to be able to answer 40 science-related questions that refer to figures and graphs that look something like this. It's not actually as bad as it seems. I have no idea what a lithosphere is. I have no idea what an asthenosphere is. I don't need to know any of that in order to be able to answer this question. So according to figure 1, the temperature of the outer core is approximately between, and this is what I mean when I say the ACT science section is more of a scavenger hunt than anything. So really what I'm trying to do here is find the outer core, which I know is between these 2 dashed lines. And then I know how to read a graph. So I know I'm on the y-axis there. I know I'm between these 2 points. I know that answer choice is C, 4,800 and 6,300. I have no idea what I have found. I have no idea what that answer choice actually means, but I know that that's the answer. And this is where students can struggle with the ACT. Because it's such a fast-paced test, it has the tendency to turn on everyone's voice of self-doubt. And that voice of self-doubt goes something like this, which is, Drew, you did that awfully quickly. Are you absolutely sure that answer choice is C? And if I give into that voice, I'm going to double check this or triple check this or even quadruple check this. And on the ACT, students just don't have time for that. So in addition to giving them strategies and approaches, it's also about building up students' confidence that they can see a question like this and without any hesitation or doubt, circle answer choice C and then move on to that next question. So again, a lot of overlap in terms of the content between these 2 tests, but very, very different in terms of the philosophies behind them. With the SAT being more of a power test, more challenging reading, more challenging questions, requires a deeper understanding, a narrower focus of skills, especially on the math, on that digital SAT, with 70 to 80% of the math questions being algebra. So algebra 1 and algebra 2, less than 10% of the math is going to be geometry. But again, more time per question. Whereas the ACT being more of a speed test, reading's a little bit more straightforward. Questions are a little bit more straightforward. Does require that instant recognition though, as we saw with that ACT slope of the line math question and that ACT science question. Broader scope of skills on the ACT, especially on the math, where only about 30% of the math is algebra. So way more geometry on that ACT compared to that SAT. But again, the difficulty is the pace of it. Almost a total sprint from start to finish on that ACT. Which then brings us to the $1 million question. And the $1 million question goes something like this, which is, all right, Drew, so we know colleges accept both tests equally. So just earlier on in the process, if we can decide, right, are we going down an SAT path or are we going down an ACT path? It's just taking that potential amount of work and cutting it in half. But which test should we focus on? Should we focus on the SAT? Should we focus on the ACT? And I include this cartoon just because there's tons of urban legend out there that this type of student's going to prefer the SAT, this type of student's going to prefer the ACT. At the end of the day, the best way to make this decision is to try both, ideally in a practice setting. And we offer free practice tests, one free digital SAT test, one free ACT test. So we run them every weekend out of our offices. So out of our Newton office here just outside of Boston, and then out of our New Canaan office in New Canaan, Connecticut. Students can also take it at home though. So don't hesitate. Please reach out to us to take advantage of these. It's a great first step in terms of getting a baseline score, but more importantly, trying to decide, are we going down an SAT path or are we going down an ACT path? And then there is a concordance table. So we can compare a PSAT score, because we know you can use a PSAT score as a baseline score for the SAT to an ACT score. You can also compare an SAT score to an ACT score. And I know this table is a little bit small, so just to orient us here, 24 out of 36 on that ACT, the equivalent to about an 1180 out of 1600 on that SAT, and then 30 out of 36 on the ACT, the equivalent to about a 1370 out of 1600 on that SAT. Keep in mind, 70 to 80% of students who try both tests are going to score equally well on both. So often the decision, right, whether we're going to go down an SAT path or go down an ACT path, it really comes down to a student's gut instinct a little bit. We kind of joke with them, like, which one did you kind of hate the least? Which test do you think plays to your strength? If you're going to do some prep for it, which one would you rather prep for? Which test do you feel you're going to have an easier time getting that score to be more reflective of what you're doing day in and day out in school? And I will say the ACT, they are not changing the format of their test. They are not going to an adaptive format. Students will still have the opportunity, and in fact, most students are still going to take that test, that ACT paper and pencil. So that's also factoring into students' decision whether to go kind of down that SAT path or ACT path. How did it feel taking that digital online SAT versus a paper and pencil ACT? So that decision, or asking students about that, also can give us some clarity in terms of if we're going to lean SAT or ACT. Obviously, if a student performs significantly better on one test over the other, generally that's the direction that we're going to lean. And then just real quickly in terms of APs, there are many students who are in AP classes and taking AP exams. So at this point, students should definitely start having these tests on their radar. So knowing the schedule and knowing when they will be taking those tests is helpful. Obviously we want students to kind of be able to show off on these AP exams as well, and to be able to put their best foot forward on it. They are long tests. They're 3 to 3.5 hours. They're not tests that students can cram for successfully. So we do encourage students to start thinking about their study plan in terms of how they're going to approach taking these tests in May. And then I will say that we have our full-length practice AP exams up and running, so students can take them online. So if a student's in an AP course and taking an AP exam, we do encourage you, reach out to us in terms of having students be able to take a full-length practice test. It is very, very helpful for students. Even now, we generally encourage students to start thinking about taking a practice test now. We know it's a little bit early in terms of that they haven't maybe covered all of the material that's going to be on that test, but at least gives them some practice with it, gives them some exposure to it, just again, so they know what to expect when they get those tests in May. And then we do one-on-one AP tutoring as well. So definitely feel free to reach out to us if you're interested in that as well. Okay. And then in terms of creating that testing plan, right? When should students be taking these tests? So here's when the tests are offered. You can see with the exception of January, they're offered pretty much, or they are offered every single month of the year. But we cannot stress this enough. Please don't have this be your student's standardized testing plan, right? We don't want students taking these tests like 5, 6, 7, 8 times. It's just too much. Most students aren't one and done just because the first time they take these tests, they're always a little bit nervous, but most students are going to peak on these tests after taking it twice, maybe a third time in that fall of senior year as needed. Because keep in mind, student scores don't just keep going up and up and up and up every time a student takes a test. At a certain point, their scores are going to plateau. At a later point, we can actually see these scores start to drop because burnout on these tests is real. So we don't want to do this. We want to do something a little bit more sane and sensible, which might look something more along these lines. And again, just a little bit earlier in the process, if we can decide, right? Are we going down an SAT path or are we going down an ACT path? We're just trying to avoid going like ACT to SAT to ACT to SAT and then rinse, lather, repeat on that in that fall of senior year. So again, we don't want to do this. We want to do something a little bit more sane and sensible, which might look something more along these lines. So for our sophomores who are on the call, it's great that you're joining tonight. You do have a lot of time on this. Our general recommendation for our sophomores is over the summer, late spring or over the summer, reach out to us, take a practice ACT, try that practice digital SAT, and then we can start mapping out that plan. And again, definitely reach out to us. We can help customize a plan that's going to work well for you. We can help you decide, right, are we going to go down an ACT path or go down an SAT path? So this student did that. Took the digital PSAT, as a lot of students do at school, in October. Actually ended up scoring equally well on both tests. So they don't actually need to be taking this practice ACT again in December or January. So what some other students will do is just, for whatever reason, if they decide, you know what, I don't want to start thinking about this over the summer. So some students will do the digital PSAT in October and then reach out to us and do practice ACT kind of over November, December. So then we can compare those scores and then pick that path. So this student actually ended up taking the practice ACT over the summer with the digital SAT, scored equally well on both, as many students do, but had a slight preference for the digital SAT. So we ended up going down that SAT path. Targeted March for the first attempt, June for that second attempt. The student is in AP courses. So taking AP exams in May. So just wanted to build that in their timeline. And then has early fall of senior year for that third and final time as needed. So there are some students where we'll push the timeline up. So recruited athletes, for instance, where coaches just might want scores a little bit earlier. Also, stronger students or confident testing takers. Again, we might push that timeline up, have them take that first test a little bit earlier than in that mid-spring of junior year. But if we do that, just note, I usually recommend that students take that first test in December of their junior year. I just want them to get into junior year a little bit, get their classes under their belt, get settled into school before we start having them take an official ACT or SAT test in December. So same plan here. Student over the summer, try to practice ACT, also tried the digital SAT. Again, scored equally well on both, but just had a slight preference for the ACT. Knew that they wanted to start a little bit earlier, so targeted December for that first ACT, February for the second, and then late spring of junior year for the third, knowing if they needed it, they have early fall of senior year again for that final attempt. So again, we don't want to do this. We want to do something a little bit more sane and sensible. But again, definitely reach out to us. Our excellent program directors can walk you through the diagnostic tests, can help you analyze them, do a little bit of a deeper dive on them, and kind of help you map out that plan and which test and which path you want to go down. Okay, just in the last couple minutes that I have here, I do just want to go over super scoring, just so you're familiar with this term. So almost all colleges super score the SAT. So what that means is if your student's taken the test more than once, they'll send in the full score reports from the different administrations of the test. But then what that college is going to do is they're going to cherry pick the highest subsection scores and build what I call a Frankenstein score. So even though this student did not get a 1290 in a single sitting on their SAT, that 1290 is going to be that student's SAT score for those colleges that super score. And again, almost all do. A couple of reasons why colleges are super scoring. The first one is you got to keep in mind that college admission officers, they do read applications supportively, and super scoring is one way in which they can look at the standardized testing piece in that most supportive light. The other reason why colleges are super scoring, we all kind of loathe the US News and World Report college rankings, but published SAT and ACT scores still factor into those rankings. So it is in the college's best interest to be able to report as high SAT and ACT scores as they can, and super scoring is one way in which they can do that. And let me just reassure you, for those colleges that super score, they are in fact super scoring. They're not playing gotcha here. They're not trying to trick you into sending more score reports so they can see the 580 reading and writing, see the 640. They're not going to ask themselves which one's the real one. Is it the 580? Is it the 640? Should we average those together? They're going to take that 640 each and every time because it's in their best interest to do so. And then colleges also super score the ACT. Works the exact same way. The student took February, June, and then September. They cherry pick the highest subsection scores and then recalculate that composite. So same story, even though the student did not get a 31 in a single sitting on that ACT, for those colleges that super score the ACT, that 31 is going to be that student's ACT score. And then that third part of the plan, just how and when should students prepare for these tests. So depending on a student's starting score and their ultimate goal score, most students are looking at about, I'd say, anywhere from about 10 to 16 weeks of study and prep going into that first official test. And then when we talk about test prep, three major components that go into that test prep. So the first is content, right? Just knowing all the math, knowing all the grammar that's covered on these tests. The other is strategy, just a game plan for every section and every question that students are going to see. And then really students, they do need some time to practice, right? So through full-length practice tests or through sections of practice tests, under time conditions, just to mimic the look and feel of what students are going to experience when they take these tests for real. And obviously our one-on-one test prep programs, they're designed with these three components in mind. Just to give you a feel for the way our test prep works, all of our programs are customized. Again, depending on what a student's starting score is and their ultimate goal score is. Sessions for us are usually weekly for an hour and a half. And then there is 2 to 3 hours of homework between sessions. That's where that kind of practice comes in. So just to give you a feel in terms of the commitment on this, it's about 4 to 4.5 hours per week that that students are doing. And let me just reassure you, we work with monumentally busy juniors. It does take some time management, but students can fit the prep in and can put the time in. But again, definitely feel free to reach out to us. We can customize a plan that's going to work best for your student, because at the end of the day, really what we're trying to do is help students hit their full potential on these tests and just help them get a score that's more in line and more reflective of what they're doing day in and day out in school. So I know we covered a lot tonight, but just to sum up what we covered, again, we know that our students are still going to be applying in this test optional environment. So whether they're juniors, sophomores, ninth graders, so really encourage students to see these tests with that kind of everything to gain, nothing to lose mindset, knowing that they're going to be in control of their scores. Again, we encourage students to take a practice SAT and ACT a little bit earlier on in the process. So we get a baseline score, but more importantly, it helps us choose a path, right? Are we going down an SAT path or are we going down an ACT path? And again, many schools on your students' final list will be test optional. You can take advantage of that strategic submission, so you can decide on a school-by-school basis whether to submit those scores or not. And then I just leave you with this. We know that the number one thing that colleges are looking at is the students' grades, their transcript, their day in and day out performance in school. So a good testing plan, it has to prioritize schoolwork over any kind of test prep. It doesn't do us any good to raise standardized testing scores if it's at the expense of day in and day out academics. And I know it's easy for me to say on this side of the computer, but really at the end of the day, these are just tests. They are not the be all end all of the college admission process. I really want students to see these tests almost as a chance to show off a little bit, right? It's another objective data point that they can potentially share with colleges just to show their academic readiness, that they are ready to handle the rigors of that particular college or university. And again, I know we covered a lot of ground tonight. We do have some time for questions. I see that some questions have come in, but my email's here, so definitely don't hesitate to reach out or to give us a call to connect with one of our program directors. And again, I already mentioned this, but we do offer one-on-one, both in-home and online test prep. We do academic tutoring as well. We also do AP tutoring. Again, take advantage of the practice SAT and ACT tests that we offer. And again, I already mentioned this, but our AP practice tests are up and running. So if your student is in AP classes and taking those AP exams in May, definitely reach out to us so that students can take a full-length test if they haven't had an opportunity to do so. All right, so thanks again, everybody, for joining. I hope this was helpful. We do have some time for questions. All right, so first one. How does one decide which colleges to submit scores? So this is a great question. I do encourage students to reach out to their college counselor or advisor because they'll have some opinions and some guidance in terms of whether to submit scores or not. It really can depend. This is such like a difficult question to answer generally. So generally speaking, right, with those published ranges, obviously you want to be generally somewhere in that range to submit that score. I've heard you wanted to be in the upper end of that range, but there's also exceptions to that, where if students, for whatever reason, like maybe they've had an interrupted schooling experience and they just want to show, right, that that they've learned a lot academically. So they potentially want to share a score that might be maybe a little bit lower, but still it reinforces that they've learned some skills. But it's hard to give you kind of a hard, fast rule on this, but definitely looking at a student's or school's published ranges can help. And then also, if your student has access to Naviance or to their score account, depending on the colleges that they're applying to, you can see student scores from your high school, what scores they applied with potentially, and kind of how they did in that acceptance process. But it's like anything with the whole college admission process, there's always some nuance to it. Let's see, if the test is adaptive, how can they go back and review? If it is done module by module, how many questions typically in each module. So yeah, so within a module, you can go back and review. So if a student's working through the first module, in that module, they can go back and they can answer any questions that they skipped or they want to go back to. Obviously, once they've completed the first module and they've moved on to the second module, they can't then go back and change any of their answers in that first module. But within a module, they can move around and they can go back and change any of their answers in that module. And then on the math, to give you a sense of this, I think it's around 24 questions per module on the math. And then I think on the verbal, I think it's either like 27, 28, or 29 questions on that verbal. But I can double check that for you as well. Let's see, the ACT is so long, does this not pose a greater fatigue factor for, students who are on accommodations or for ADD students? So for students with accommodations, they are able to get extended time for both the SAT and the ACT. Just note that there is a formal process that you need to go through. You'll work with your school to get those accommodations. But the most common one is time and a half. So to answer that question, like, yes, the ACT is a longer test. So it's 3 hours as opposed to 2 hours and 15 minutes. And then if students have that accommodation for the extended time, that 3-hour test becomes a 4.5-hour test. Having said that, a lot of students who have that accommodation actually end up preferring and going down an ACT path as opposed to an SAT path. And the reason for that, yes, it's a longer test. Certainly, it requires some stamina to get through that 4.5-hour test. But because the questions are a little bit more straightforward and the reading's a little bit easier on that ACT, and the difficulty comes from the pace of it, if students have that extended time, and the pacing of that test becomes less of a factor for them. Sometimes students who have accommodations for both, so both for the SAT and the ACT, even though the ACT is a longer test taking experience, sometimes they prefer going down that ACT path. It's not a hard and fast rule though. Our general recommendation still stands for them. I would still want students to try that digital SAT with the extended time. Again, it's a shorter testing experience, and also do the ACT with the extended time so we can compare scores and also kind of get their reaction to what taking those tests was like with that extended time. But for students with ADD, especially if they have that time and a half accommodation, even though it's a longer test, we don't dismiss that ACT out of hand. But I do want students to try a full-length practice one just to see what testing for that 4.5 hours is like. So would you recommend that a student take both tests? So generally we want students to kind of pick a path and stick with it. Just to give you a feel for it, I'd say roughly between like 85% and 90% of our students are going to pick a path, stick with that test, and achieve their goals, their overall goals with that test that they originally chose. About 10 to 15% of our students are going to try that other test. The reason for that is just for whatever reason, their scores are plateauing on that first test, or, either the SAT or the ACT, and they just want to try kind of that other test to kind of see how that goes for them. Just note, because there is so much overlap in the content between these two tests, any prep that students do for one is going to help with that other test. But vast majority of our students are going to pick a test, stick with that test, and hit their goals on that test. But there is a smaller percentage of students where just for whatever reason, they might switch and try that other test. But if your student ends up doing that, just note any prep that they've done for one is going to carry over to that other. It's not like they're starting from square one with that. But generally speaking, just for efficiency and knowing that colleges here in the US accept both tests equally, we are going to try to pick a path and stick with it, just because I don't want students flip-flopping back and forth between the two tests. So I hope that's helpful. Yeah, I know with that ACT accommodation, it being 4.5 hours, I know it's long. We tell kids, like, bring snacks, bring water, whatever you need. But kids can fight their way through it. We've had a lot of kids, hit their goal score on that 4.5-hour extended time test. But I definitely want students to try that digital SAT with that accommodation to see how they do, because it is a much shorter testing experience. Let's see. Let's see, does Summit always also assist with college application essays? So no, so we stick on the testing side of things. We don't do any of the sort of college admission and application side of things, but we work with a number of consultants who help with the essays. So if you're looking for some help there, definitely don't hesitate to reach out to us, because we can give you some names of some good people, even though we don't do it ourselves. But thanks for asking that. All righty. Let's see, we're at about 8:15 now. So thanks everybody for hanging in there. I hope this was helpful for you. So appreciate your staying with me to the end here and all the great questions that came in. Again, you'll get the link to the recording. So you'll get the link to the recording. It should be either tomorrow or on Friday. But again, my email's here. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you need anything. As you can tell, we love talking shop and helping students and families and supporting all of you kind of as you think about this and as you think about that testing plan. All right. So with that, we will end it here. But thanks so much, everybody. So appreciate your taking the time. And I hope this was helpful for all of you.